It was a 3 a.m. house fire that should have ended with a tragic accident report. But what investigators found inside turned a grieving husband into the prime suspect in a cold-blooded murder. And the scariest part? He was a cop. Welcome back to Death Row Diaries. If you're fascinated by true crime, courtroom drama, and the twisted psychology of people who cross the line, you're in the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our deep dives into America's most chilling murder cases. Now, let's talk about Brett Seacat. A sheriff's deputy, a father of two, and by all appearances, a family man. But when his wife, Vashti, ended up dead in a burned-down house, all signs started pointing to a horrifying truth no one expected. Let's rewind to the night it all began. It was still dark outside when a frantic 911 call came in at 3:57 a.m. on April 30th, 2011. On the line was Brett Seacat, a former sheriff's deputy turned police trainer. His voice? Panicked. His story? Chilling. He told dispatchers that his wife, Vashti Seacat, had just set their house on fire and then turned a gun on herself. According to Brett, he had been sleeping on the couch when his cell phone rang. It was Vashti. She told him to grab their two young sons and get them out of the house. That was the last thing he heard before a bang. He raced upstairs, he claimed, and found her dead from a gunshot wound. Flames were already spreading. He grabbed the boys, ran outside, and placed them inside her car for safety. Then he went back into the blaze, still on the phone with 911, to try and save his wife. But the smoke was too thick. He had to retreat. Sounds like the story of a devastated man who just lost everything in the blink of an eye. Except, when police and firefighters arrived, they noticed something strange. He didn't seem right. No visible sweat, no soot, no burns or blood. His clothes were clean, his face calm. Almost too calm for a man who had supposedly just fought through a house fire, lost his wife, and saved two toddlers. As Ron Kefauver from the Kansas Supreme Court later put it, his demeanor seemed to be out of place for the circumstances. Still, investigators had to consider the possibility that Vashti truly had taken her own life. But as the fire died down, the truth started rising from the ashes. Brett and Vashti weren't just any couple. They were high school sweethearts. They tied the knot in a picturesque beach wedding in Belize, moved to Brett's hometown of Kingman, Kansas, and began what seemed to be a peaceful life. Brett went into law enforcement, and Vashti built a career in employee relations. But behind closed doors, things weren't so romantic. Friends and family said everything changed after the kids were born. Brett became increasingly controlling, jealous of Vashti's independence, critical of her career ambitions, and dismissive of her efforts to have a life outside the home. He was a law enforcement trainer, someone who taught recruits how to investigate crime scenes, understand evidence, and read human behavior. But in his own home, he was treating his wife more like a suspect than a partner. Vashti, meanwhile, was growing. She was reconnecting with friends, focusing on her health, and seeing a therapist. For her, divorce was not just an escape, it was a chance to breathe again. They had already decided to split. In fact, the night of the fire was supposed to be the last night they would ever live together. That evening, they sat down to discuss money, custody, and how to move forward. Brett would later claim that Vashti became overwhelmed and ended it all in a moment of despair. But her family didn't buy that for a second. "My sister would never kill herself," said Rich Forrest, Vashti's brother. They weren't just grieving, they were suspicious, and they weren't the only ones. If you're still with us, this is just the beginning. Drop a "fire" in the comments if you think something about Brett's story already sounds off, and let us know what your first red flag was. And don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the algorithm expose more stories just like this one. After the fire was put out and investigators entered the master bedroom, what they found raised serious questions. The room was charred to the bone, the bed frame had been burned down to bare metal coils, and there, lying on what remained of the bed, was Vashti's body, burned beyond recognition. At first glance, it looked like a suicide, but the positioning of the gun stopped everyone cold. The weapon was found under her left side, barrel facing downward. That didn't make sense. If she had shot herself while lying down, the gun should have dropped beside or behind her. If she had been sitting up, it should have landed on her dominant side. But this? It just did not make sense, said Special Agent David Folletti of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. Then came the autopsy report, and it raised even more red flags. The bullet that killed Vashti entered behind her right ear and traveled slightly downward, leftward, and forward. That trajectory wasn't just unusual, it was nearly impossible to achieve without contorting your own arm unnaturally, especially for a right-handed person. Dr. D. Michelle Dupree, a forensic pathologist, put it bluntly. To do that trajectory, you have to almost bend your arm around, which is very uncomfortable to do to yourself. But perhaps the most damning detail? There was no soot in her lungs, no carbon monoxide in her bloodstream, which means one thing. Vashti was already dead before the fire started. Inside Vashti's car, detectives found what could have been a heartbreaking clue. Her journal. In it, they found a chilling final message.
"I'll be watching over you from heaven." She also addressed Brett directly, writing, "I can't do this anymore. I can't fight it out." A classic suicide note? That's what Brett wanted investigators to believe. But handwriting doesn't lie. A forensic expert determined that the note wasn't written by Vashti at all. It was forged. That wasn't the only planted evidence. Detectives also discovered printed-out research left on the kitchen table. Quote, "How to kill someone and make it look like a suicide," unquote. Brett claimed it was just scrap paper he accidentally brought home from the training center. Right. The deeper investigators dug, the more his story unraveled. And yet, Brett stuck to his script, refusing to change a single detail. Let's pause here. What do you think? Is this the sloppiest staged crime scene ever, or the work of someone who truly thought he'd never be caught? Leave your thoughts below, and if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. While Brett painted a picture of a wife spiraling into depression, the truth was far more empowering and damning. Vashti wasn't falling apart, she was rising. She had recently lost weight, reconnected with her support system, and had begun seeing a therapist on her own. Friends said she had started going out more, making plans, even looking forward to a fresh chapter in life. And she wasn't hiding her intentions either. To her sister Kathleen, Vashti confided that she was done with Brett, done with the emotional weight of the marriage, and ready to move on for the sake of her kids and her peace of mind. Far from suicidal, she was finally seeing the light. And yet, she was scared. She had voiced it more than once. "Do you think he'd ever hurt me?" she had asked close family members. She wasn't being dramatic, she was being cautious. Because she knew something no one else did. Brett Seacat wasn't going to let her leave easily. And when people feel control slipping away, especially someone with a badge and a tactical mindset, they get dangerous. Have you ever seen a case where a victim saw their own murder coming? If Vashti's fear gave you chills, tell us in the comments, and share this video with someone who believes appearances never lie. One of the most damning pieces of evidence didn't come from a lab or a forensics expert. It came from a neighbor. At 3:15 a.m., a nearby resident reported hearing a gunshot. That's a full 42 minutes before Brett called 911 at 3:57 a.m. If Vashti truly called Brett to tell him she was lighting the house on fire, why was a gunshot heard well before that supposed phone call ever happened? Investigators believe that Vashti was already dead by the time the fire started. And during that gap, Brett had time to stage everything: the car, the kids, the forged journal entry, and the entire narrative he would cling to for the next 2 years. It wasn't just suspicious, it was cold, calculated, methodical. The signature of someone who thought he could beat the system. Someone who trained people to detect lies and then relied on the very same tactics to hide his own lies. By May 14, 2011, just 2 weeks after the fire, Brett Seacat was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated child endangerment, and aggravated arson. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Brett kept insisting he was innocent. He even had supporters who believed him. After all, he was a respected figure, a law enforcement trainer. If anyone knew how a case could fall apart from a lack of evidence, it was him. But the state wasn't playing games. They had the forged note. They had the flawed timeline. They had a body burned after death. And they had the undeniable reality that Vashti never stood a chance once Brett made up his mind. The courtroom became a battleground of truth versus tactics, and Brett wasn't ready for what came next. In 2013, Brett's trial began, and it was brutal. The defense argued that Vashti was unstable, depressed, and desperate, that she ended her own life under the weight of divorce, stress, and emotional turmoil. But the prosecution dismantled that claim piece by piece. They brought in therapists, family members, co-workers, all testifying to Vashti's improving mental state and plans for the future. They exposed the planted suicide note and laid out the 42-minute delay between the likely gunshot and Brett's 911 call. In just 5 hours, the jury came back with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. Brett Seacat was sentenced to life in prison, plus 6 years and 3 months for the additional charges. In 2016, the Kansas Supreme Court upheld the conviction. There would be no new trial, no second chance, no escape. It was just an immense sense of relief, said Vashti's brother Rich. He killed my sister, and now he's going to pay for his crimes. This wasn't just another domestic violence case. This was a master manipulator, a cop, a husband, a father, who thought he could script a perfect crime. But he underestimated one thing: the strength of a woman who refused to go quietly. Vashti's story didn't end in ashes. It ended in accountability. And her voice, through her family, through investigators, and through all of us telling her story, still echoes today. Because no amount of training can save a man from the truth when the evidence finally speaks louder than the lies. If this case shook you, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because here on Death Row Diaries, we're just getting started. More chilling tales of justice, betrayal, and truth are coming your way. Until next time, stay safe.